I stood in the middle of the house my father had spent his life building, but now I was a stranger in the place that was supposed to be mine. They had changed everything, torn down his legacy, and now they wanted me out. My mother was on their side and so was my husband. No one cared about me or my father's legacy. But they were forgetting one important thing: I was in charge here. And I wasn't going to let them take it away from me. I, Hannah, 34, was a software engineer working for one of the largest technology companies in the United States. My job required intense focus, problem-solving, and logical thinking skills I inherited from my father. Robert, a construction entrepreneur, was not only my biggest inspiration in life, but he laid the foundation for everything I have today. My father was not a man who talked much about success, but he always believed in the value of hard work, honesty, and responsibility. He built his career from nothing, turning a small company into a reputable business specializing in restoring old houses. My father started his business in the 1980s when the economy was still in turmoil. He often told me that on the first day he opened his company, he had only an old pickup truck, a toolbox, and a strong belief that if he worked with his heart, success would follow. Over the years he proved that to be true. He focused not only on building and renovating houses, but also on preserving the historical value of each project. He once said, "Building is not just about laying bricks on bricks, but also about preserving the stories of the past." His clients, whether ordinary families or architectural preservation organizations, trusted him completely because he always put quality first and never took shortcuts. I grew up surrounded by the smell of new wood, the sound of drilling and cutting echoing through the carpentry shop, and blueprints spread out on my father's desk. The house I live in, and the house my father left me, is his greatest pride. It is not just a house, but the passion, the crystallization of years of sweat and toil. It was a Victorian house with wide porches, carved wooden windows, and polished floors. My father had not only bought it, but had renovated every detail himself, from the built-in bookcases, the oak window frames, to the small workshop in the garage that he had turned into the perfect workspace. Every brick and piece of wood in this house had a story, and I learned a lot from watching him work. He taught me not only how to build a bookshelf or fix a sagging door, but also how to think and approach a problem. He told me, a house is like a software system. If it is not properly maintained, it will gradually deteriorate. I didn't think these lessons would influence my career, but when I entered the tech industry, I realized that the way my dad managed construction was similar to the way I manage a software project. Every step required careful attention. Every little detail mattered. Thanks to the foundation my dad laid, I always had a stable career. After graduating with a degree in software engineering, I quickly climbed the corporate ladder and became a team leader within a few years of working there. I like the challenge of work, the discussions about algorithms and the most optimal way to solve problems. But no matter how busy I was, I still made time to return to my father's house every weekend. My life was very peaceful until I met Michael, 35 years old, who later became my husband. Michael is a talented, ambitious businessman, and also someone my father trusted a lot. We met at a startup conference when I was a senior in college, and he had already started his own business. My father liked Michael from the first time we met. He always appreciated people with will, desire, and a progressive spirit, and he saw that in Michael. After we got married, my father not only treated Michael as a son, but also helped him a lot in his business. He introduced Michael to connections in the construction industry, helped him land important contracts, and even mentored him on how to run a business. My father believed that Michael was a trustworthy person, a man who could build a solid family with me. When we moved to live near my parents, he spent a lot of time guiding both of us on how to manage finances, how to invest in real estate, and especially how to preserve the house that he had worked so hard to build. He always told me, "One day this house will be yours, and you must make sure that it will always retain the values that I put into it." I never thought that one day I would have to fight to protect the very thing that my father had left me. When my father suddenly passed away from a heart attack, I not only lost a father but also a mentor, a teacher, and my closest friend. His passing left an unfillable void in my heart. But I never expected that the peace that my father had worked so hard to build would be threatened in such a short time. I could not imagine that the husband my father trusted, the man I once considered my life partner, could turn his back on me so cruelly. I believed that this house would always be mine until Michael sided with my stepmother and kicked me out of my own home. When my father died, my world seemed to collapse. He was not only my father but also my teacher, my guide, my role model for my entire life. A sudden heart attack took his life at the age of 58, leaving me with a void that nothing could fill. The days that followed were a long series of mourning and pain. The house he had worked so hard to build suddenly became cold, no longer the warm laughter every evening or the conversations about work and life between father and son. I still remember clearly the last time we spoke. He talked about preserving the family legacy. I up at the value of a house, not only in its material things but also in the memories and people attached to it. But just a few months after his death, I realized that I was the only one who still appreciated those things. My mother, Evelyn, was as devastated as I was, or so I thought. She and Dad had been together for more than 30 years, building what I always thought was a perfect life. I believed that her loss would make her appreciate what he left behind, that she would want to preserve his memory in this house. But I was wrong. After a few months, she began to change. She went to a church support group for widows, and there she met Frank. He had lost his wife and, according to my mother, was understanding, caring, and supportive. I had no problem with my mother seeking comfort after a loss, but what surprised me was the speed with which it all happened. After only 6 months, she announced that she and Frank were getting married. Before I could accept that my father was gone, before I could get used to life without him, I was faced with a strange man entering the house as my mother's new husband. There was no adjustment period, no mental preparation, no discussion between my mother and me. One day she simply announced that Frank was moving in, along with his 2 children from a previous relationship, Ethan, 30, and Madeline, 32. They would live together in my house, the house my father had left me in his will. I cannot express the sense of betrayal I felt when I heard this news. This was the house my father had built with all his heart, where every brick and every piece of wood bore his mark. It was not a property that could be shared casually with strangers. But my mother did not see it that way. She considered it a family home and believed that it was normal to welcome new members. I had no right to stop her. Frank's presence changed everything. From the start, he did not act like a guest in the house, but rather as if he were the owner. Without any hesitation or reserve, he immediately began to make suggestions about renovations for the house, claiming that it was outdated and in need of updating. Every time I walked into the living room, he was discussing with my mother how to fix this, replace that, as if this was a house he had bought and not my father's creation. But Frank was not alone. Ethan and Madeline moved in with them, bringing with them the baggage and attitudes of self-righteous people. Ethan, a tall, athletic-looking man, immediately announced that he was going to turn my father's carpentry shop into a gym. Without consulting me, without asking for my consent. When I came home from work one day, I found that my father's equipment had been pushed into a corner to make room for a treadmill, dumbbells, and a set of exercise equipment. When I protested, Ethan shrugged and said that my father was no longer around, and that I rarely used the workshop. Madeline, on the other hand, took a different approach. She wasn't as blatantly occupying the space as Ethan, but she began to change things to her liking. The paintings my father had hung in the house were replaced with modern pieces that she liked. The wooden statues he had carved with his own hands were put in storage to make room for decorations that suited her taste. One day I found that the curtains my father had loved so much had been thrown out, replaced with plain white ones that Madeline said were more minimalist and elegant. I felt suffocated in my own home. Things were changing in ways I couldn't control. But the worst thing was not just the change in the house, but the feeling of being left out, of being treated as an outsider in the place my father had left me. My mother was no longer on my side. Where she had always been supportive and understanding, she was now completely influenced by Frank. Whenever I complained about the changes, she told me I was too sensitive, and that I had to accept the fact that the family was growing. I tried to stay calm, tried to remind myself that I was the owner of this house, that I had the right to make decisions about it. But with each passing day, I realized that little by little my control was being taken away. None of them respected me or what my father had left. They were not here to build a family, but to take everything my father had held dear. I tried to endure. I tried to give in. But I had no idea that the real turmoil had not yet begun. I could not imagine that my husband, Michael, would be the one to push me out of my own home. The changes in the house had happened so quickly that I felt like I was just a temporary guest in my father's place. At first I tried to stay calm, convincing myself that everything would be fine, that my mother was just looking for a change to fill the void left by my father. But as time went on, I realized more and more that I was wrong. My mother no longer saw the house as a place to hold memories of my father. She saw it as an opportunity to start over, and Frank was the one who was in control. From the day he moved in, Frank didn't act like a newcomer, but immediately assumed the role of the landlord. He didn't ask me for anything, didn't keep me at arm's length, and instead began planning his own renovations. At first it was just small changes, changing a light bulb, repainting a few walls, but gradually he went further. One day I came home to find the built-in bookshelves my father had built himself had been dismantled, the wood piled up in the yard waiting for the garbage truck. I was stunned by the sight. These weren't just bookshelves, they were a part of my father, the place where he used to sit and read blueprints, the place where I used to rearrange his favorite books. When I asked why, Frank just shrugged and said they were too old and needed to be replaced. But Frank wasn't the only one who saw this house as a place where they could freely change things as they pleased. Ethan took over my father's woodworking shop, turning it into a gym without permission. The shop had been my father's pride and joy, where he and I had spent hours together, where I had learned how to use every tool, where he had taught me that everything in life could be fixed if you approached it correctly. Now it was a sweaty room, with treadmills, dumbbells, and large mirrors mounted to the walls. My father's tool chests were pushed to the corner, and the half-cut pieces of wood he had used to make furniture for the house were thrown out like trash. Madeline took a different approach. She wasn't as direct in her destruction as Frank or Ethan, but she began to invade every space in the house, changing everything to her liking. The curtains my father had loved were replaced with plain white ones because, according to Madeline, they looked more minimalist and luxurious. The decorative items my father collected on long business trips were replaced by modern art pieces that she loved. Little by little, she made this house hers without saying anything. I tried to protest, but my mother not only did not stand by me, but also supported Frank's every decision. When I told her what was going on, she just sighed and said that I was clinging to the past, that I needed to learn to accept change. She was no longer the woman who shared stories about my father with me, who said that everything in this house was a part of him. Now she only cared about her new life, about how to make Frank feel most comfortable. But what disappointed me most was not my mother, but Michael, my husband, the man my father had trusted and helped so much. I thought that at least he would understand, would stand by me, would help me protect what my father left behind. But Michael did not. Not only did he not object to the changes Frank was making, he supported them. Whenever I tried to talk to Michael about what was happening, he seemed annoyed, as if I was making a big deal out of it. He said I was being stubborn, that this was my mother's house, and that she had the right to decide what was best for it. When I reminded him that I was the legal owner, that my father had left it to me, he shrugged and said that paperwork was not as important as family. Gradually, I began to feel that I had no place in my own home. Every decision was ignored, every opinion I had was considered meaningless. I was no longer considered the owner of this house, I was just an unwelcome guest. I tried to stay calm, tried to find a compromise, but I realized that no one cared about my feelings, no one wanted to listen to me. Frank saw me as an obstacle in the way he wanted to build this house. Ethan and Madeline saw me as a stranger, someone they could ignore because they had my mother's permission to change things as they pleased. My mother saw me as a stubborn child who refused to accept that life had changed. And Michael, the person I trusted the most, had turned his back on me completely. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. I couldn't keep watching my father's legacy being destroyed bit by bit, couldn't keep letting them continue to take away my control. But I also didn't know what I could do when everyone in my family was against me. It wasn't until Michael made a decision I didn't expect that I realized this fight wasn't about changes to the house, it was about whether I was allowed to stay. I never thought the man my father had trusted would kick me out of my own home. But that's exactly what was about to happen. I'd always thought that no matter how things changed, whether my mother sided with Frank or Ethan and Madeline saw me as an outsider, Michael would at least be there for me. He was the man my father had trusted, the man I'd shared my life with for years. But I was wrong. As it turns out, the worst betrayal comes not from those I've long lost trust in, but from the person closest to me. I remember the day everything fell apart. When I got home from work, exhausted, Michael called me into the living room with an unusual seriousness. Frank, my mother, Ethan, and Madeline were all there, sitting on the sofa as if it were a family meeting that I had not been informed of. No one said anything for the first few seconds, but I could feel the tension in the air. Michael took a deep breath, then said in a voice so calm I could hardly believe my ears, "I think you should move out of the house." I was stunned. I looked at him, waiting for an explanation, a sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But no, his gaze did not waver. My mother looked down at the floor, avoiding my gaze, while Frank just folded his arms and looked at me like I was a stubborn child who refused to accept reality. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his face expressionless, while Madeline looked at me with fake pity. Michael continued, his voice full of reason, as if he were explaining something obvious that I hadn't yet grasped. "Frank and his family have contributed so much to this house. They helped repair, upgrade, and renovate it to make it more modern and comfortable. What about you? You just want to keep the old things your father left behind without thinking about the people living here." Those words were like a knife stabbing straight into me. I couldn't believe that this was the person I once loved, once trusted. I couldn't believe that he could stand there and tell me that what I was doing was wrong. I couldn't believe that he could protect those who had blatantly taken everything from me, while I was just trying to keep my father's legacy. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a room full of strangers. I regained my composure and said clearly, slowly, word by word, "This is my house. My father left it to me, and I am the legal owner. No one has the right to kick me out of here." But Michael was unfazed. He looked at me, his eyes colder than ever, and replied in a tone I had never heard from him before, "Papers don't matter. We are a family, you can't be so selfish." Family. The word rang through my head like a cruel joke. This was not my family. My family was my father, the memories he left behind, the evenings we sat on the porch talking about life, the weekends he taught me how to fix every little detail around the house. My family was not the people who had destroyed everything he had built, who saw me as an obstacle to be removed. And Michael, who I had thought was part of that family, was now on their side. I looked at my mother, waiting for a reaction, a word, some kind of confirmation that she still cared. But she just sat there, her eyes averted as if she didn't want to face me. She had chosen Frank, just as Michael had chosen their side. I had no one left. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady as I said, "You want to kick me out of my house, Michael? Is this what you think is right?" He didn't answer immediately. There was a moment of hesitation on his face, but it was quickly gone. Finally, he repeated, "We need to think about the common good. You can't keep things the way they are. I understood. This wasn't a fight about the house anymore. This was a set of conditions. Either I would accept Frank and his family's continued control of everything, or I would leave. There was no other choice. I stood there, feeling a deep pain in every cell of my body. Everything I had ever known, loved, believed in, was now crumbling before my eyes. But one thing I knew for sure, I would not let them take what my father had left me. If they thought I would just leave meekly, if they thought I would accept defeat, they were wrong. I might have lost my father, my mother, and even the husband I had loved, but I would not lose this house. They wanted to throw me out? I would show them that I was not someone to be dismissed. I am not someone who is easily dismissed. When I left the living room that day, I no longer felt pain or despair, it was all determination. I had kept quiet long enough, had been patient enough to avoid conflict, had tried to compromise, but those people had never considered me part of the decision. They had treated me like a stranger in their own home. If they wanted to kick me out, I would make them understand that this was not their home. I immediately contacted the family attorney, Mr. Callahan, who had worked with my father for many years, and who knew the terms of his will. When I told him what had happened, he was silent for a moment, then said simply, "They have no right to be there if you don't want them to be." That statement was like a jolt of confidence. I was not being unreasonable in this situation. My father left the house to me with full legal title, and I had the right to decide who could live there. I immediately sat down with my financial advisor to review my options. As I looked through all the documents about property values in the area, I realized something I had never considered before: if rented out, the house could generate a large income. Over the past 3 years, property values in the area had risen significantly, and given the location of the house, I could definitely turn it into a solid investment. If I couldn't enjoy the peace of my father's home, I could at least use it to my advantage, one that my father would certainly approve of. I drafted the eviction order with Mr. Callahan, making sure everything was in compliance with the law. I didn't want to leave any loopholes that they could use against me. When the paperwork was done, I gave them 2 weeks to leave the house. As I stood in the middle of the living room, looking each of them in the eye and telling them my decision, my mother began to cry, begging me to reconsider. She said I couldn't do this to my family, that I was leaving her homeless. But I didn't believe her anymore. She had had the chance to side with me, but she chose Frank. Frank, unlike my mother, did not plead. He looked at me, his eyes cold, and then began to threaten me. He said I would regret it, that I was destroying my own family. But the family he spoke of wasn't mine. It had never been mine. I had nothing left to lose. I'd lost my father, my mother, my husband. People who were supposed to protect me were the ones who pushed me out. But there was one thing I still held on to, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. This house belonged to me, and I was taking back what was mine. I knew they wouldn't leave easily, but I also couldn't have imagined the lengths they would go to try to keep it. Just a week after I'd filed for eviction, my mother and Frank staged an intervention, a perfect show to make me look bad in the eyes of everyone. When I got home that afternoon, I found not only Frank and my mother, but also relatives, old family friends, and even the pastor from my mother's church. I knew right away that this was no ordinary conversation. They were prepared, one by one, with carefully crafted words to sway me. They didn't want to discuss, they wanted to accuse. I heard the constant barrage of accusations: "You're doing something wrong, you're ruining your family, your father would never want this." The pastor spoke of mercy, of forgiveness, while a distant relative whose name I don't even remember spoke of filial responsibility. Frank stood there, arms folded, saying nothing but a look of triumph on his face that clearly showed he knew exactly what was going on. I said nothing. I let them talk, let them try to make me out to be heartless, selfish, disrespectful to my family. I looked at each of them, listened to the accusations they threw at me. And I realized one thing: they weren't here for me. They were here for my mother and Frank. They didn't care about the truth, they just wanted to preserve the familial facade they thought I was breaking. But I wasn't here to justify, I was here to prove the truth. When they were done, I placed a stack of documents on the table, evidence of the damage Frank had done to this house. Photos of every part of the house changed, every item thrown away, every trace of my father erased. I showed them my father's carpentry shop turned into a gym, the hand-built bookshelves torn down, the original woodwork replaced with cheap materials. I didn't say much, I just let the facts speak for themselves. Finally, I took out the letter my father had left, a letter he had written long ago, explaining why he had entrusted this house to me. He had written that he trusted me, that he knew I would protect it, that I wouldn't let anyone destroy what he had built. I read each word, slowly, clearly, so that everyone in the room could hear. There was a moment of complete silence after I finished. Some of them started looking at each other, confused. Some of the older people, those who had known my father, started nodding, as if they had finally realized the truth. Some people said nothing more and just left quietly. The room seemed to lose its initial accusatory air, and it was clear to me that this intervention was falling apart. My mother was still crying. Frank was still standing there, red with anger. But the people who really knew my father were no longer on their side. And just like that, their act was over. On the day of the deadline, I stood in front of the house, waiting for the moment I knew would come. Frank, my mother, Michael, and those who had been on their side had no choice. They were forced to leave. No more pleading, no more arguing, no more accusations that I was a family wrecker. They had done everything they could to keep this house, but in the end, the truth and the law were on my side. I watched them load their belongings into the car, their faces filled with a range of emotions: anger, bitterness, disappointment, even contempt. My mother refused to meet my eyes. Frank threw me a resentful look before getting into the car, as if he still couldn't believe someone like me would dare stand up to him. Ethan and Madeline didn't say a word. Michael stood there for a long moment, as if expecting me to change my mind at the last minute. But I kept quiet, because there was nothing left to say. He had made his choice, and today he had to face the consequences. When they left, I walked into the house and looked around. The house was devastated. What had once been an important part of my memory was now a pale shadow of what my father had left. The intricate woodwork he had painstakingly restored had been replaced with cheap industrial materials. The walls that had once held the house's original paint were covered in a lifeless white. My father's workshop, where I had learned to use every tool, where he had taught me every technique, was now a cold, empty space, though scratched by the gym equipment Ethan had placed there. Dim and numb. I knew that it would be impossible to restore everything to its original state, but I also knew that I could do something to preserve what was left. I contacted craftsmen who had worked with my father, people who understood the true value of this house. We'll start over. A few months later, Michael and I divorced. There was no regret, no anger, just emptiness. He never fought for me, never stood up for me, not once. I understood that we were never really a team, because when times got tough he was quick to stand up for others without hesitation. I had nothing left in this marriage. After all, I had lost so much: my family, my loved ones, the relationships I had once held. I became the villain in their story, the unfilial daughter, the selfish wife, the one who kicked my family out of the house. But I had no regrets. I knew I did the right thing. Because if I hadn't stood up, my father's legacy would have been completely erased. And that was something I could never forgive myself for. One early morning, I stood in the woodworking shop, looking around at the space that had slowly returned to its original state. The tool cabinets were back in place, and my father's design sketches were hanging on the walls again. I took a deep breath, smelling the fresh wood in the air. This was more than just a room. This was where I learned my father's most important lesson: steadfastness and integrity. One day I would teach my daughter about her grandfather's legacy, about the man who built all of this with his own hands, about the value of hard work, of honesty, and of standing up for what really matters. I would show her that sometimes standing up for what's right means being the bad guy in the eyes of others. And I know that if my father could stand here, he would look at me with pride and say, integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one else does. Life sometimes forces us to make painful decisions. I used to believe that my family would love and protect me, but in the end they were the ones who pushed me away from the home my father left behind. The most painful betrayal doesn't come from enemies, but from those you once trusted the most. I've learned that protecting yourself doesn't mean being selfish. If you don't speak up, someone else will decide everything for you. Don't be afraid to stand up for what is yours, even if the whole world is against you. There are people who will try to manipulate you with emotions, with moral responsibility, making you feel guilty for doing the right thing. But if you always give in because you are afraid of losing someone, you will lose yourself. I lost the support of my family, I lost the husband my father trusted. But I have no regrets, because if I didn't stand up, my father's legacy would have been completely erased. I chose the harder path, but at least I can hold my head high. If you are in a similar situation, remember, no one has the right to take away what is yours. Be strong, be steadfast, and protect yourself.